Welcome back to the FITSNews studio. I am Will Folks, the owner and founding editor of FITSNews.com. You are watching another edition of the Week in Review. The eyes of America turned again to South Carolina this week as a parole hearing was held on one of the highest profile murders South Carolina has ever seen. Susan Smith's story is coming at you soon. We've also got a report from Dylan Nolan on escalating hostilities in Europe and on Nancy Mace's big play at the national level. Dylan and I are going to go through everything that's happening across the world and in our nation's capital. I'm also going to sit down with our Andy Fancher for an in-depth discussion on the future of this business. What's wrong with the media? How can it be fixed? And how can it not be fixed if you follow some of the MSM outlets? All that and more coming your way on the Week in Review. 30 years ago, the state of South Carolina and the entire country were gripped by the saga of two young boys, 3-year-old Michael Smith, 14-month-old Alex Smith, the sons of Susan and David Smith, a couple from Union, South Carolina. Now, the initial story was that the boys had been abducted at an intersection in downtown Union, South Carolina by a black carjacker. However, police from the very beginning felt that story was off. 9 days after the alleged abduction, the truth came out. Susan Smith admitted that she drowned her two boys in the John D. Long Lake, 5 miles from Union, South Carolina. I'm joined by Jen Wood, our research director. Jen, I've got kids, you've got kids. This is one of the hardest stories that we've covered.
It is. And, despite it being 30 years since it happened, I still remember when it happened. I remember watching her plead for her boys on the news, and I remember when the truth came out. And I was not a mother then. So looking at this case from the eyes of a mother, it's even more heartbreaking.
Yeah, it's different.
Mm-hmm.
It's different. We're talking about this story, obviously, because the state of South Carolina, the parole board here in the Palmetto State, heard from Susan Smith this week. Her 30-year sentence, which was, again, a controversial sentence, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute, but she was eligible for parole this week. She appeared via video link before this parole board, Jen. Let's start with the outcome. Obviously, this was going to be a long shot. The murder of two young boys, her own children, a case that attracted international attention. But walk us through some of the factors that this board was going to consider, Jen.
Right. Yeah, this was always a long shot, even in the best of circumstances. The parole board looks at a number of factors, and among those factors is their record while in prison. And we all know Susan has quite the disciplinary record.
Yeah, drugs, STDs,
yes.
illicit affairs.
Yeah,
but also more recently, the documentary.
Yes,
drama?
she was caught communicating with producers of a documentary. And, that is not allowed in South Carolina Department of Corrections. It is against the rules. Alex Murdaugh got sanctioned for the same thing. So, even going into this parole hearing, she was still doing things she shouldn't be doing. The other things they look at, can this person be reintegrated into the community? Will the community accept them? If they are, they've got to go back into the community. They've got to go, grocery shopping. Will they be accepted? Will they get a job? Will they be productive? And just looking at the outcry online going into this hearing, no.
Right.
I don't think I heard from one person who said, yeah, if I ran into her, no problem. People were appalled that it was even an option for her.
Yeah, let's be honest here. Even if Susan Smith's record from the moment that she entered the custody of the State Department of Corrections 30 years ago, even if it had been spotless, there's no way in hell this was ever going to be a yes for parole. And in fact, it was unanimous among those who voted. 5 members voted. Now, 1 member of the parole board declined to cast a vote, but that was apparently due to the fact she was a former interim warden at one of the institutions where Smith was incarcerated, so voting on her parole would have been a potential conflict. So she did not cast a vote, but the 5 members present and voting of that parole board unanimously rejected Susan Smith's appeal. And I want to talk a little bit about that appeal, Jim. We got a clip here of Susan Smith addressing the panel. Let's get to that real quick.
First of all, I want to say how very sorry I am. Um,
It's okay, Susan. Just talk with us.
I know that what I did was so horrible. And, and I would give anything if I could go back and change it. And I love Michael and Alex with all my heart.
Jen, those are some familiar tears, aren't they?
They sure are. And that was the first thing I thought of when she, started crying. I thought of that video of her pleading for her children. I mean, just not buying it.
How did the cops catch on to this? We've heard about this traffic light in Union, South Carolina. Smith was telling police that she pulled up to the traffic light and it was red, and that the carjacker at that point stuck a gun in her face and told her, give her the car. But they realized quickly when she told them there were no witnesses, that no other vehicles were at that intersection. They realized something was up, didn't they?
Yeah, that intersection was a censored intersection. So if there were no other cars at the intersection, it would not have been a red light. And they knew that from the get-go. So they had questions about her story from the start. And, I remember when I was talking to Tommy Pope in our interview earlier this year,
Tell everybody who Tommy Pope is, for
so
those
the
who don't know.
solicitor who, we'll hear from him in a second, but the solicitor who prosecuted her initially, he said, in terms of a carjacker, they don't want to take a car with kids in it.
Yeah.
So I think they had a gut instinct that something is wrong. And Union, if you haven't been to Union, it is a very small community. I mean, that's one of the only traffic lights in town. And I've been to that intersection. I've been to that lake. I've been to the courthouse. It's a very small community.
Now, police actually, when they realized early on that Susan Smith was lying, that was their first clue that this entire thing was a fabrication, but they didn't have at that point any evidence or a confession or anything of that nature. That would all come later. But they did search the John DeLong Lake near Union, 5 miles out of Union. They did search it, but apparently didn't go far enough and didn't find the vehicle with the two boys inside. And I did want to play this clip here, Jen, because this was we're going to get to Tommy Pope in just a second, but this is his assistant solicitor, Kevin Brackett, who is now the 16th Circuit solicitor up there in Union. This is him, and this is just incredible. He's describing that moment where they did go back after Susan Smith finally confessed. And this is Kevin Brackett describing what happened at that moment.
I was on the banks of John D. Long Lake, standing there with about 40 or 45 people, 50 people, as the tow truck from Greer's Wrecker launched its line into the water where divers hooked it up to the car and pulled it out. Total silence as that car emerged from the dark water. Everybody sitting there hoping and praying that maybe it was a different car. Maybe it was a wrong car. Maybe the kids weren't in there. Not a word was said. It was one of the most haunting memories of my life, and it will live with me forever.
Jen, it just breaks your heart.
Yeah, that Kevin Brackett's testimony struck me because it was clear how, these grown men 30 years later are still so affected by this crime. And the car did when because there was a ramp there. It's now all barriered off because there was another fatal accident there after. when the car went
Well, there
into
was a fatal accident. This was no
this is no
accident.
accident, yeah. When the car went into the water, it traveled further and it took 6 minutes to sink. 6 minutes. So they recreated it after they found the boys and pulled, the car out for trial purposes. They did a recreation. That car took 6 minutes to sink. 6 minutes.
And I remember the testimony at the original trial of the Department of Natural Resources diver who found the car and talked about seeing the hand of one of those boys in the window. Just, yeah. Let's talk about the punishment that this crime, many believe, should have warranted. And in South Carolina, we have the death penalty. In fact, it was recently reinstituted after a lengthy delay. But at the time that this trial was held, the death penalty was sought by then Solicitor Tommy Pope. And you actually spoke with them about his reasons for that. And I think we've got a clip. Let's cut to Tommy Pope here, the former solicitor.
So I'm Tommy Pope. I was the 16th Circuit Solicitor, and this was a death penalty case. And the reason it was a death penalty case, the solicitor has that discretion, but the reason it was a death penalty case, the facts and circumstances. And I just felt strongly that had the black man with the toboggan committed the crime, people would expect a death penalty. If David Smith had committed the crime, people would expected the death penalty. And I thought it was very important that the betrayal that Susan Smith showed, that she be treated the same. We knew it was going to be difficult. We knew there was a likelihood of not achieving the death penalty. But I think it's important to note the jury at the time actually asked, what did life mean? And you may be aware, but in that time, life did not mean life. Life became life in 96. We tried the case in 95. So the jury was asked, and the judge was required to instruct the jury that you take life and death in its plain and usual meaning. Carrying that forward, the jury showed her mercy. The jury gave her a life sentence. But one of the jurors, or more of the jurors, after the fact, and speaking to the media, said that they believed the life sentence was the greater punishment because they believed that Susan should have to reflect on what she did to Michael and Alex, that she should have to spend the rest of her life thinking about what she'd done.
Jen, he makes a great point.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if it had been a black carjacker, if that false story had been true, or if it had been
David Smith, even the husband and father,
death would have been immediately sought. So Tommy Pope's argument is, hey, good for the goose, good for the gander. But walk us through this, because the jury in this trial, a little over an hour, that's all it took them to convict Susan Smith for these murders. But during the death penalty phase of the trial, and in South Carolina, for those of you who don't know, the same jury that hears the case decides on the death penalty.
Mm-hmm.
They decided against giving her the death penalty. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I think, as Tommy said, they thought they were truly giving her life. They thought that she needed to sit in a prison cell for the rest of her life and think about what she had done. I don't think that they realized that parole would be an option for her 30 years down the road. And, like Tommy said, he believes in truth in sentencing. He believes in the intention of the jury, and he believes the jury intended for her to spend the rest of her life in prison. But that was before the South Carolina passed on January 1st, 1996. Very shortly after she was sentenced, South Carolina passed a life is law, meaning when you get a life sentence for a crime like this, it is truly a life sentence.
No parole.
Right.
Yeah. And Alec Murdaugh, obviously, we covered that story extensively when he received those 2 life sentences, no parole.
Mm-hmm.
Again, assuming those verdicts wind up standing. But let me ask you, though, we talked about why they decided not. Obviously, we know why they went with life, but why did they opt against the death penalty? It's had to do with her background.
Yeah. So, and this came up in her presentation, her attorney's presentation to the parole board. But her defense argument was that she had a lot of mental health issues. She had intended that day to commit suicide and at the last minute backed out. And she did, go through, there was a lot of testimony about the abuse she went through growing up from her stepfather. And it was troubling.
Mhm.
And that, I mean, I think that could have played into the jury's decision. She certainly tried to make it play into the parole
The parole
board's
decision. They
decision.
were not having it though.
No, they were not.
Well, and I want to ask you about this because this is something, and I want to hear. We've got a clip here of David Smith, her husband, who again stood with her during those 9 days when he thought, like most of the country, that she was telling the truth. Uh, he stood with her. He believed her. Now, not only is he still grieving those two boys whose pictures he wore on his jacket at that hearing, as he did back in the trial, but he also, again, grieving the lost trust, the lie that he has to relive all over again, being deceived like that. Let's listen to what David Smith had to say. Just some powerful words from the father of Alex and Michael. Let's listen.
You know, God gives us free choice. And she made free choice that night to end her life. This wasn't a tragic mistake. It wasn't something that she didn't mean to do. She purposely meant to end her life. I never have felt any remorse from her for it. She's never expressed any to me. I never seen it on paper. No, she, as you've heard, she changed my life for the rest of my life that night. Some for the better, some for the worse, but what she did, not only to Michael and Alex, she came pretty close to causing me to end my life because of the grief that she brought upon me. But thankfully she didn't. I understand back in 95 that through the state's law, life in prison meant 30 years to life. And now that's different, but at that time, that's what counts. I understand that. But ultimately, to me, that's only 15 years per child. Her own children. It's just not enough. So I'm asking that you please deny her parole today. And hopefully in the future, but specifically today. Not let her out. I miss them very much. And I love them very much. And I will be here every 2 years going forward to ensure that their death doesn't go in vain.
Jen, he's got to come back every 2 years and do this. Is that fair?
No, that's horrible. I mean, that breaks my heart. You know, he has remarried. You heard from his daughter who spoke, and I think his daughter, that affected me too. I mean, just thinking about, you know, what she knew when she knew it. But yeah, no, I don't. No, I mean, I have a son. I have a son and a daughter, and I tell you, there is nothing like a son's love for a mother.
Yeah.
That's just the ultimate portrayal for me.
Yeah.
Just, yeah.
Jen, this story continues, again, international headlines as this hearing was held. There were media outlets from all over the world covering this parole hearing. And what was interesting about that is, you know, they were covering a hearing that literally the outcome really was not in
Right.
doubt. I mean, everyone, I think, following this case, we did a poll on
Yeah.
FITSNews earlier this year in anticipation. 91% was saying they did not think she was going to be granted parole. I think 91% was probably a generous
Yeah.
take. But as we think about this broader conception of justice, I mean, we cover so many cases here. We covered the Murdaugh case, obviously. We've got this horrific rose petal murder that we're going to be covering up in Greenville, South Carolina, where, again, a fatally flawed victim in that case, subjected to just a horrific 31 stab wounds
Hmm.
to the head and neck, just a horrifically graphic crime. But again, many argue that that victim, because of some of the things she was involved in, including the abuse, sexual abuse of her daughter, some argue, well, was it deserved? We deal with all these cases, so they're so complex. There's so many layers. South Carolina's justice system struggles, doesn't it, to get it right? I mean, we've seen not only the issues with the Murdaugh verdicts, we've seen discovery battles in that rose petal case.
Hmm.
We've seen, this parole system where this poor man has to come back every 2 years and relive the death of his 2 young boys. South Carolina's justice system struggles, doesn't it?
It does. And it was interesting because going into that parole hearing, they ABC had the footage from the hearings leading up to it. So you could, and I was driving to South Carolina, so I was just watching the parole hearings, and it was really interesting seeing the process and seeing a number of those people up for parole. The victims had to come back. This wasn't their first go round.
Yeah.
And some of them, one's appeared, and his brother had died, and he was the only one left there to make a statement on behalf of the victim. He was the only one still alive. His mom had died, sister had died. It was hard to watch, but I thought it was important to watch because it's not something that I think the public sees often. And I think it's good for the public to understand what victims, it's not over when the trial's over. They deal with the aftermath of a crime for the rest of their lives.
That's true. Well, one thing is clear, folks, the justice system here in South Carolina may be flawed. Justice system here in our country, flawed. But something that I think it's important to remember when you're talking about cases like this, there will be justice, one way or the other. And whether you believe in the karma wheel or heaven or hell, what this world doesn't get, rest assured, folks, one day there will be perfect justice for those boys and perfect accountability for Susan Smith. So whether you vote Republican or vote Democrat, South Carolina is a state which picks presidents. The first in the South and first in the nation, presidential primaries are driving forces in choosing who resides at 1600 Pennsylvania. South Carolina has also produced many figures that play prominent roles on the national stage. We're going to get to one of those here in just a minute. But South Carolina also has a knack for making political news that goes viral. And we've got one such story that I think is on the verge of going viral. And I'm talking, of course, about Senator Boobs, newly elected state senator Tom Fernandez. If you haven't heard of this guy, folks, I'm betting before the year's over, you will. This is a newly elected state senator from the South Carolina Lowcountry who rolled into the Capitol complex in a $200,000 Hellfire Apocalypse. Now, this is a modified Jeep Gladiator that is literally coated in Kevlar, 6x6, massive beast of a vehicle here, but it wasn't necessarily the car that attracted attention at the State House. Obviously, it did attract attention, but it was a decal in one of the windows of this machine that drove some eyeballs. It said, "My other ride has big boobs." Now, again, at the South Carolina State House, folks, it's very easy to be offended. There's a lot of people literally just walking around looking for reasons to be offended. And needless to say, this sticker hit the mark. But what was interesting was not necessarily the controversy, but it was Senator Fernandez's response to it, which was, quote, "What, are they jealous? My wife has F cups and theirs are flat chested." Anyway, Dylan Nolan, like I said, I think this guy's going to be making some viral political news before too long. But as we pivot a little bit, looking at the national political scene, obviously it's been a huge, huge national, international week. Big repercussions. I want to talk first about Donald Trump's cabinet. There was some major news The Attorney General nominee, Matt Gaetz, this was the most controversial of Donald Trump's pick. Gaetz took himself out of the running this week. Dylan, your thoughts on how that shook out?
It's interesting. I wonder what the play was there in Mar-a-Lago, and I think somebody will write a book about this sometime in the next couple of years. But at this point, it's very opaque as to what exactly went on there. Was this a strategic decision to try to draw fire away from other nominees, or was it made plain to Gates that he had no path to get through the Senate confirmation process, and a tough decision was made at Mar-a-Lago? I don't know, but it was certainly not something that I think a lot of folks expected to happen this week.
Well, a lot of folks also said it could have been a test. Trump was trying to figure out who's with him to the hilt, who's going to back him to the hilt.
Well, he knows, and apparently there's 4 Republican senators who aren't there with him.
Oh, wow. Well, that's an interesting choice by a Republican senator in the aftermath of an election that I think everyone can agree went decisively for President-elect Trump. Let me ask you about this, though, Dylan. We look at those appointments. Matt Gaetz's replacement as the AG designee, Pam Bondi, the Attorney General of Florida, generally regarded as a solid pick for that office. Any of the other Trump picks stand out to you, controversial or?
Obviously, we're going to see some more questions raised around Pete Hegseth just this week. Police report that was filed against him, I believe in 2017, was released in full. It obviously is redacted, but it accuses him of sexual assault. I read it. I would encourage anybody else to read it. You can find it all over the internet. It should be noted that charges were not filed in this case. It was referred for prosecution. He did settle a civil settlement related to this. So whether or not he ends up being the nominee, this is definitely going to be something that's going to be brought up throughout the Senate screening process.
Also making some news, we talked earlier about South Carolinians driving headlines on the national stage. Former UN ambassador, former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley taking some pot shots at 2 of Trump's cabinet nominees. Interestingly enough, she wasn't shooting at either Gaetz or Hegseth. She fired her ammo at Tulsi Gabbard and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Your thoughts on Nikki's weighing in on this?
Yeah, I mean, she's clearly associated herself with the neocon wing of the party, and so it doesn't really surprise me that she's taking shots at Tulsi, who is probably the most prominent anti-neocon on in the list of Trump's appointees. She famously, while the United States was getting ready to go to war in Syria, traveled to Syria surreptitiously, had conversations with Bashar al-Assad, and concluded that the United States didn't need to be going to war there. I think this is probably a conclusion that the majority of voters, having seen our Middle Eastern policy for the last 20 years, agree with, but it's something that in Washington, D.C. is like pure heresy to say. So to see somebody like Nikki Haley, who, she's a tool of that part of the D.C. establishment, to see her doing that is not at all surprising, and I think it shows why Trump is smart to not include her in anything in this administration. The problem is, I think he's opening the door to the next generation of Nikki Haley's. We'll see how his current cabinet ends up shaping up, but putting a guy like Rubio in charge of the Department of State is certainly interesting. It doesn't indicate that he's learned too many lessons from the first term.
Yeah, he struggled on those Secretary of State picks, hasn't he?
Well, and, I think he's 0 for 3 on AGs in his first administration. Pretty much all 3 of them directly defied him. It will be very interesting to see how the Department of Justice ends up operating, as well as the intelligence community under this administration. Will he be able to successfully put people in place who will carry out his agenda?
Indeed. And as you mentioned, with 4 at least Republican senators already defying him, that raises problems. Will he get all of his people confirmed? But Dylan, while we keep one eye on what's happening in Washington, D.C., obviously some major developments unfolding across the globe, the other side of the world, a conflict that you have been covering extensively here at FITSNews.
As of you, for years.
Yeah. I love that we cover this stuff. It's important because it is our money and our national security and the blood of our soldiers potentially at stake here. And we're talking about what's happening in Ukraine. Major escalation over the last few weeks, driven by a decision by Joe Biden, or let's be honest, whoever's in charge of Joe Biden's administration, probably not Joe Biden. I'm going to go out on a limb here and guess that. But the Biden administration decided to allow Ukraine to fire long-range missiles into targets in Russia. First time this has happened. Obviously, they've allowed these weapons to be used in formerly Ukrainian territory, but these are the first strikes into Russia, which, as Vladimir Putin made clear several months ago, was an escalation, was a sign that, according to him, Russia would, and now is, at war with NATO. Dylan, did things just get real in Ukraine?
I think they got real in February of 2022. I would clarify, Putin has said he's at war with the UK. He has not said he's at war with NATO. But certainly NATO has crossed the line, which Putin said. He retaliated very symbolically when he used an ICBM. This is what the Ukrainians are reporting. It might be a more medium range, but for folks who don't know, ICBMs are basically the ballistic missiles which were designed to be able to deliver atomic weapons. So the way that they operate is they shoot a large central missile up out of the atmosphere, and then they have a multiple reentry vehicle which has the specific warheads on it, and then those can target targets in a very wide geographic region because it's coming from so high up, and that's how atomic weapons are delivered. And allegedly, the one that he used, and he deployed this in Ukraine, is one that's new technology and is not able to be defeated by Western air defense systems. So he did not seemingly tip the delivery vehicles with any weapons, conventional or atomic, but it's basically Putin sending the signal to the West, I have the technology which can deliver atomic warheads to your cities.
Yeah, basically saying you can't stop me.
And this is the first time anybody's ever deployed one of these on a battlefield. And you watch the video and it's just, you see the plasma arcing across the sky as these vehicles re-enter. And it's unlike anything we've ever seen.
So each one of those arcs could potentially be a nuclear device if you wanted.
Well, and the thing is that, those plasma arcs would seem like nothing if they were the prelude to an atomic explosion.
Let me ask you this. You've written about this conflict, about where it was on the ground, the conventional battle between Ukraine and Russia. You've written about the difficult position in which Ukraine has found itself on the receiving end of that Russian invasion. And obviously, FITSNews, unlike the mainstream press, the Western press, we have written extensively about the roots of this conflict, which I'm not going to go out and officially say it was exclusive American provocation which led to this conflict, but
there's blame on both sides, most certainly. Any news outlet which tries to tell you it's just us or it's just the Russians are spewing propaganda for one side or the other. But there's certainly a rational case to be made that the United States and its allies in NATO pushed boundaries which we should not have pushed that led to this.
Well, walk us through the status of this conflict right now. You've talked about Ukraine was losing this war, that perhaps that would lead to negotiations. What's the situation on the ground right now?
So I think we should look back a couple of months ago. Ukraine took a piece of territory in Russia in Kursk Oblast. I wrote at the time that it was a piece of land of minimal strategic value. And that's kind of something that gave me heartburn because I was like, am I missing something? Did these Ukrainian war planners have some grand strategy which I can't discern? And so that kind of kept me up after I wrote that because, you're committed once you put something like that down. Obviously, I would issue a correction if I found that I was wrong. But the months since then have proven that initial assessment was correct. This piece of land, they're now paying pretty dearly to hold. The North Koreans, actually 10,000 North Korean troops have arrived. They have a formal defense pact with Russia, a bilateral defense pact, and the Ukrainian invasion of Russia triggered that. So they've sent 10,000 troops. And the point is that if they were trying to get Russia to pull their troops off the front line to deal with retaking Kursk Oblast, that didn't happen. In fact, Russia doubled down on their troops on the front line, knowing that the Ukrainians were going to have to expend significant material to keep this small piece of Russia, this relatively strategically immaterial piece of Russia. And so they've actually been advancing on the front lines for the last couple of months. And some of those advances have been pretty significant. Now, it's not like they're going to take Kiev tomorrow, but also a slow and steady creep taking more and more Ukrainian territory has led to, for the first time since the outset of the 2022 war, the majority of Ukrainian civilians now are supporting the government coming to the table and putting an end to the war.
Wow. So obviously you've got that happening within Ukraine, and certainly on our side of the pond, a new administration coming in. Donald Trump has said that he will end this war quickly. What do you think his plan is for ending the war, Dylan?
he's going to be put in a very interesting position here with the Biden administration seriously escalating the situation on their way out the door. Donald Trump is not a man who likes to be messed with. He likes to execute his foreign policy with an iron fist. So it actually wouldn't surprise me, even though he's been campaigning on ending this war, if he rearms the Ukrainians so that they can come to the negotiating table from a position of strength. Now, that's kind of one side of things. The other side of things that you can look at is the same, deep state that's been targeting Trump, this group within the American government that many people see as kind of a rogue, unaccountable group. Maybe he wants to punish them and doesn't want to let their proxy state come to the negotiating table from a position of strength and is willing to concede far more than the Europeans or the Ukrainians are willing to concede. So it could go either way. I think it's important to point out that Ryan Rout, the guy who tried to assassinate him while he was playing golf, was trained in Ukraine by the Azov Battalion. So, if I'm Donald Trump, that's not something I would forget.
Well, he probably won't also forget that this is the same deep state which accused him of receiving golden showers from Russian hookers in hotels in Moscow. So one of those false reports that came out during his last transition, trying to kneecap his foreign policy. Dylan, a lot of folks look at these Trump stories, and again, the first time around, they gained some traction. Folks were really buying into it. Now, don't you feel, again, this is now 8 years after that first Trump transition, people have kind of seen through some of these fake news reports, haven't they?
Yeah, and I mean, the proof is in the pudding. If you look, Comcast is looking to offload MSNBC. Rachel Maddow just took a $5 million pay cut. CNN fired literally all of their daytime reporters in the last year. They just did not renew any of their contracts. They're big primetime hosts. They're also taking multi-million-dollar cuts. So these media organs, which were the mouthpiece of the intelligence community, because basically these cable channels would just repeat whatever they wanted them to say. That's how we ended up in Iraq. That's how we ended up supporting this war to the extent that we have. They're losing steam.
Yeah. So, Dylan, I want to shift gears from the battle for territory in Ukraine to the battle over bathrooms in our nation's capital and potentially across the country. U.S. Congresswoman Nancy Mace of South Carolina. We mentioned earlier we're going to talk about South Carolina is making waves on the national stage. Nancy Mace has made a huge impact this past week, challenging the Capitol Hill policy on men in women's restrooms. And it all stems from the election of the first, I don't know, what do we call this person? Guy who thinks they're a girl being elected to Congress. And Nancy has said, balls out of stalls. That is actually a direct quote. No balls in women's stalls. Dylan, what's the genius behind Nancy Mace's move here?
I mean, the interesting thing is we just saw in this election that the voters largely rejected the excesses of the left socially, and this is something that was cited in exit polls. And it's something that internally, if you listen to Democrat strategists, which is something that I do, I like to hear from the left, I like to hear from the right. This is something that's widely been acknowledged by Democrat strategists as something that the party needs to move away from to be able to succeed in 2026, to be able to succeed in 2028. And what does Mace do but go in there almost immediately upon returning to Congress and make them double down on this position, which is highly unpopular among their own base,
So,
let alone everybody else.
so Mace comes out, basically says only women in women's restrooms. 200 plus tweets on this issue in the span of like literally
12 hours, it was
Yeah.
insane.
I mean, just absolutely rapid firing on this. But the Speaker of the House adopted her position, said that, hey, representative from Delaware, you're a guy. You're going to have to use the guy's restroom.
Right.
So, Dylan, the political play here, obviously forcing Democrats to double down. What are they going to do in response to this? What if you're a Democratic lawmaker from a swing state with a swing district? What do you do in response to this?
You lose your next election because you can't piss off your base, but your base doesn't see you speaking out against something that's clearly unreasonable. I think anybody who's a parent of a daughter would really appreciate it if their daughter's not forced to undress next to males, whether they're at a school locker room or the U.S. Capitol, which I think is largely symbolic, although Mace has promised to introduce a bill to ban this across all federal properties, which would actually have a large impact because there are so many spread throughout the nation.
Yeah, she made it clear once the Speaker adopted her position in the U.S. Capitol. She was going to take this fight nationwide. A lot of backlash for Nancy Mace still, and since this happened, in fact, we've got one of the tweets up here. This is her former spokeswoman, in fact, slamming her for a hooker boob job. Just very aggressive attacks coming at Nancy Mace, not just from those on the far left, but again, this was one of her own former staffers here.
Yeah, her Twitter bio reads ex NatSec journo. That should tell you everything you need to know. That means swamp creature to the bone. She might work for Republicans, but if this person were to go to a Republican state and talk to actual Republicans, I don't know how well that would go.
Yeah, fair enough. So you think the backlash here only benefits Nancy Mace, even though she's in a...
No, I don't, because there's a lot of Republicans who have people I follow on X, people I follow on other online information platforms, who have expressed that they think that she's annoying. And I think it's because she's filming half of these videos walking around in like this fur boa, like she's a pimp in a movie. You know, and that's how Nancy operates. She's loud, she hits hard, she'll use cuss words. Not everybody's gonna like it. I think that she's highly effective, but there is blowback from even people on her own side who just don't like the way she operates. But the blowback from the left is what's actually going to be meaningful here, in that it's going to force people to double down on a really unpopular position.
Well, and also this is going to be very relevant to our discussions in the months and years to come, because Mace, for those of you not following, here in South Carolina, she is one of the top contenders for the governor's office in South Carolina in the upcoming 2026 election cycle. Dylan, how do you think this impacts her chances with GOP primary voters in the Palmetto State?
See, it's interesting because, we speak about the wearing the boa like the pimp. And that's the kind of thing that I think can turn her off to some people that might potentially be voting in this gubernatorial primary. I think that's where that could end up costing her. But I do think that at the same time, there's going to be a lot of people who are going to look at this and say, well, she's clearly a fighter. And, nobody can say that Nancy Mace is not a fighter. So if the people of South Carolina want to send a fighter to the state house to be the governor, perhaps they'll send her.
Well, you've got two very contrasting approaches. You got Nancy Mace dropping this bathroom glitter bomb that has just exploded all over the national media. And then you've got the other top contender for governor in South Carolina, Attorney General Alan Wilson. He's been down at Mar-a-Lago rubbing shoulders with the next U.S. Attorney General, Pam Bondi, in all likelihood, rubbing shoulders with those MAGA donors. Alan Wilson adopting that slow and steady, building a network behind the scenes approach, Dylan.
Classic Alan Wilson politicking, consensus building a coalition. And he's not the only one that right now who's doing that work behind the scenes to set up a gubernatorial run.
Oh, well, Dylan, obviously, let's talk about that field. We've got Mace, we've got Wilson. Who else?
Upstate businessman John Warren, who has previously made a run at it. We're hearing Sean Bennett in the Senate has been kind of looking at a run as well. And the night is yet young. We might as well see Pam Yvette. I know that, lieutenant governor, that's usually a position that you're occupying if you want to be the governor. We haven't really seen Pam Yvette do much of anything. Not that the position of lieutenant governor affords you the opportunity to do that, but I don't know a single person in the state who knows her personally who's not fond of her. That being said, I don't know if she has that base of political capital that's large enough to compete with big dogs. So it's going to be an interesting gubernatorial race, and we might even see some more people throw their name in the hat here in the next couple of weeks.
Indeed. And folks, this race matters, not just here in South Carolina for who has the bully pulpit here in the Palmetto State, but the governor of South Carolina, a potential springboard. Obviously, Mark Sanford was a top potential presidential candidate in 2012 until he imploded himself with that little hike on the Appalachian Trail. In fact, we had a story up just this week on FITSNews, Mark Sanford thinking about a U.S. Senate bid. We'll keep our eyes on that. But Nikki Haley, his successor, obviously ran for president in the Republican primary this past cycle. Some say she's a potential 2028 presidential prospect. I think her star is on the decline, Dylan. But the governor of South Carolina, not just a position that Palmetto State residents should watch. It's a position that folks who track Republican politics and maybe one day Democrats will get back in the groove here in South Carolina. Dylan, they've been getting beat pretty bad here for a while, haven't they?
Yeah, I don't know if that day is going to be anytime soon.
Yeah. But if you are a Democrat voter watching this, know that South Carolina, the 2028 Democratic first in the nation primary. Folks are saying Kamala Harris is the front runner already. Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, might run. We're going to see a lot of those politicos come in here. Unlike the mainstream press, though, FITSNews, you'll hear very bluntly what we think of those candidates, but also You'll hear us open these mics up to those who've got different views, who've got dissenting views. Dylan, talk a little bit about our open mic policy before we go.
Yeah, I mean, Will and I, obviously we have our opinions, but we always welcome anybody who has a different opinion to write a column. We will run it on the front page of our website, just as big, just as bold as anything that we write ourselves, even if it's 180 degrees in the opposite direction. If you want to call Will and I Russian assets, go for it. We're very happy to have everybody's opinions on our website.
Indeed. So in the aftermath of the last election, in the aftermath of a devastating hurricane that ripped through the American Southeast, there's been a ton of focus on the media, on how they cover things, both politically, natural disasters, but whether or not there's narratives at play that go against what's actually happened, that go against the truth. Media has struggled to find the truth in recent years, and I'm joined now by Andy Fancher, who has been on multiple sides of the media equation in his career. MSM reporting, now here at FITSNews. But Andy, the last couple of weeks, you've been at the center of some of these stories, the conflicts between these legacy outlets and the new press. And I wanted to ask you real quick, you've been up to North Carolina, Western North Carolina now 4 times in the aftermath of Hurricane Helene. You're going back this coming week.
Right.
You were the first to report on the true magnitude of the death toll up there, for which you were blistered by government-funded media, the NPR up there, by legacy media here in the Palmetto State. This landscape that we're in, it's war, isn't it?
I mean, it's been a war. I mean, I was first made aware of this warscape probably back in 2015 was when I really started hyper-focusing on media. Love him or hate him, Trump was the person who really steered my attention towards MSM. And I will admit, back in 2015, I loved watching somebody assail the media and kind of provide the first check and balance that we had ever seen at the national scale. And then that buddied with just some friends that I had made along the way and doing a passion project interviewing World War II veterans for a majority of my teenage years really shifted me in the direction of, okay, maybe I want to be in broadcast journalism. I was ignorant at the time. I actually thought that this thing, this magnificent, unsinkable ship had a chance. And studying this in school, literally buying every AP handbook that came out because I took this so seriously, we were being forewarned by our own professors that, hey, if you hop on this ship, understand it's already taking on water. And I said, aye, aye, Captain. And that's exactly what I did. Little did I know, I stepped headfirst into a dumpster fire that is my former employer, owned by Gray Television, and we won't go into the myriad issues that happened while I was there before I voluntarily resigned on my own merit because I saw which direction this ship was heading. But, to answer your question in short, yes, it is a warscape. It has been like this for decades, perhaps as early as 1895 when the first radio broadcast was sent out. And here we are now. It has been coming to a peak, and now we've got one of the largest broadcasting companies in the country announcing a wide-scale layoff amid wide-scale AI training. I feel like I'm watching Skynet unfold in reality. That's the antagonist corp from Terminator.
And the rest of us just plugged into that matrix, right? You had a huge story, though, about Tegna this week, breaking down their new CEO, his approach to, what was it? What did he say? Safeguarding the local news or centralizing. Yeah, It sounded like a freaking infomercial for a timeshare. But anyway, Andy, walk us through what's happening at Tegna and how it impacts and illustrates some of these issues in the bigger media market.
Sure. So for the folks who don't know what Tegna is, and I wouldn't blame them for not knowing what Tegna is, first we must, I suppose, understand the media landscape itself. So every news station, every local station is owned by a select few corporations. I'm not talking Comcast, NBC Universal. I'm talking Gray Television, Tegna, Hearst, EW Scripps. These are the people that manage the affiliates to the big dogs, right? Tegna is the second largest of these corporations. Tegna owns I think, 64 newsrooms in 51 different markets across the country. That's
including
huge.
WLTX,
Including WLTX
yeah,
right here in
in South
Columbia. This
Carolina.
is their sole outpost here in South Carolina, competitor to WIS. But Tegna just recently announced amid the onboarding of this Mike Stibe character, a man with zero experience in news. You know, he purports to have worked with NBC Universal at an indeterminate time in the past, but we're talking about
It
the
was
former.
at Artsy or something, wasn't it?
What's that?
He was at the craft website or something.
Well, yeah, so he's the former CEO of an online art gallery, the
Right.
former CEO of the Knot, you know, the app that helps people, you know, coordinate their marriages. All right, which, by the way, succumbed to some major media scrutiny by the New York Post, to which he never answered any request for that. While he was at Artsy, he laid off 10% of the staff right after his hiring, and before he hopped off that ship, he laid off, what was it, 15% more of their staff. I mean, you know, it doesn't take a journalist to look at this guy and see the writing on the wall. So now within the first quarter of his hiring, he's announcing mass, wide-scale layoffs of literally hundreds of journalists or those working alongside these newsrooms to ensure that people watch the news. I mean, this is 5-alarm fire, and I'm shocked to see nobody talking about it. You know, usually AP will report on layoffs at New York Times and vice versa, but this is radio silence. So we put out a tweet this week where we leaked one of Mike Stibe's emails, a company-wide email, saying, hey, we're centralizing, i.e. purging, all right, a mass majority of the workforce here. And that prompted people from all across the country to reach out. And it has been heartbreaking to watch this thing that I ran on such hopium for, being broadcast journalism, just seeing the reality, the unfortunate reality, which is that this ship is
What do you
sinking.
attribute it to, though, Andy? Why is this industry collapsing?
A
It's 'cause they're
self-inflicted
lying?
gunshot wound is what it is, man. So y'all know me, I'm not much for endorsements around here, but you know, just looking at this from an outsider inside, you know, their incessant coverage of Trump's demerits since 2015. Again, that's when I woke up to mainstream's bias. I mean, the past 4 years haven't done any favors. You know, perpetuating unsubstantiated research on the vaccine, which I helped to do, unfortunately, by the way. I remember sweating my ass off in front of DHEC the day that CDC said it was okay for children to get the jab. That was an assigned story there. So I believe that the COVID-19 pandemic, that was certainly a wake-up call. Turning a blind eye to any of Biden's demerits while perpetuating all these rumors about Russia and P-tapes and just as Dylan noted. So, you know, this is a suicide. This is MSM's suicide, and quite honestly, it is it's horrific, but it is entertaining to watch in the same breath. Now that I'm no longer there.
Well, you talked about, in covering what's happening in Western North Carolina, you've talked about being part of the noise or actually being part of the news. You've talked about people who stand where they're told to stand and say what they're told to say versus people who actually go out in search of the truth.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and false
news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these stories simply aren't true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think, and this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
Let me ask you this. Why is it so hard for these outlets to realize, hey, why don't we get back to searching for the truth? I mean, is it that complicated what we do here? Is it really that complicated?
And I want to add to your line about, you know, news versus noise. In mainstream media, they actually write and they will actually time packages or journalists' stories in hopes that somebody with the news on in the background will turn their head and say, "What was that?" I mean, it is truly tailored as noise. I don't think people realize that. Well, fortunately, let me take that back. People are realizing it because news is dying.
Yeah.
All right, at their own demise. But to answer your question about Hurricane Helene, yeah, I think it's been fascinating being the subject of fact checking, conveniently by outlets owned by the former conglomerate that used to own me. Fact checkers standing in AC room temperature controlled newsrooms, again, just perpetuating some statement from Mount Pleasant High, while I'm literally knee deep in mud in the Swananoa River when I'm called by a counterpart saying, "Hey, guess what? You're not standing in knee deep mud at the Swananoa River, according to this outlet."
Yeah, that's not death you smell, Andy. That's just,
It's nothing to see here, is what it is, because MSM said so.
Yeah.
Now, unfortunately, the folks attacking us are the select few that haven't woken up to the fact that MSM is not your friend, made abundantly clear by Tegna's wide-scale layoffs that they soft-launched just this week, all the while training the remaining staff essentially to have a robot take its place. I mean, we're seeing under Mike Steib at Tegna, we're seeing him picket for the integration of AI in every corner of a television station, in the newsroom, in the director's booths, the people that control the cameras for the newsroom, in producing, in storytelling, and now in marketing. This is alarming, y'all. I mean, this is it.
Yeah.
I mean, here we are. The ship has struck the pinnacle iceberg.
And meanwhile, I can't even use a teleprompter app.
Probably for the best.
Let me ask you this, though. We're seeing this dramatic reshaping of the business in the aftermath of the election, in the aftermath of all these stories that are being covered now on outlets like X, where you can actually go and see what's really happening for people who are really there with their phones holding up. So people know, they're like, wait a minute, I'm hearing this narrative, but I'm seeing on X, on my other social feeds, stuff that is deliberately, or
Right.
definitively contradicting it. Let me ask you this, Al, and I ask you this as somebody who owns a media outlet.
Right.
Where does the future of our business go in this new climate? What is going to separate successful outlets from unsuccessful ones? How is the new marketplace of ideas going to function in your view?
Sure. I mean, the new marketplace of ideas, i.e. Fits being one of many. I mean, it's exactly what it is. It's that new marketplace. And we see legacy talking heads right now shifting that way too. I mean, notwithstanding what Tucker Carlson has done since his resignation, or whatever you want to call that, from Fox. I mean, just recently we had the son to one of my favorite journalists alive, Mike Wallace. Right? We see Chris Wallace leaving CNN saying podcasts. He didn't say alternative, but he listed off all the enterprises that are under an alternative media wing. And he said, that's the way. I'm proud to be in between jobs. Say what you want about Chris Wallace. He is by no means offspring to his father in terms of telling stories. But, the point I'm trying to drive at here is the legacy heads see the writing on the wall too. I'm a pessimist at heart, so I think the answer to your question would be one not filled with sunshine and lollipops. I mean, where once we had a marketplace of mainstream media ideas that has since been consolidated into 5 to 7 major corporations. I think in broad terms, we will likely see that similar consolidation years from now with this alternative media. I mean, we're seeing it right now, some consolidations of amazing alternative outlets. But, for the time being, that's the place to be. I mean, that is where you can finally break away from that stagnant narrative, all confined by the AP handbook, which, you know, I'll put on the record, I love adhering to. Even though the AP handbook is still operating on, I'm serious, they're
We
operating
call
on.
you Anal AP Andy around here.
That's the first I've heard of that. So thank you for
It's
notifying
behind your
me to that, to that room. Yeah, well, I think it's funny. I mean, the AP handbook is seriously, it's designed to adhere to typewriters. So, you know, brackets, I love bracket. I mean, brackets aren't even featured in the AP handbook. So we're still operating on a handbook for an old device while we see mainstream media integrating AI. I mean, it's mind numbing to see this unfortunate reality play out. So for the time being, we've got places like FITSNews, we've got places like Redacted, Jimmy Dore, myriad organizations where if you want the answer, you got to work for it and you can get it. But MSM is not the place for that.
Folks, I can't speak for the other outlets, but here at FITSNews, we do it pretty simple. Seek the truth, speak the truth to the best of our ability. And oh, by the way, open these mics up to you and anyone who's got a different take. Again, we bring the receipts, but we're always open to having you change our minds. Andy, we're going to keep doing that. And folks, Andy's been telling those stories. Dylan's been telling those stories. Jen Wood, who was on the show earlier, has been telling those stories. Callie Lyons, Mark Powell, our whole team. That is why we do what we do, folks, to bring you our best conception of the truth and then set it out for that marketplace of ideas to solve the rest. All right, folks, that is a wrap for this week's edition. On this show, you've heard from me, you've heard from Jen Wood, you've heard from Dylan Nolan, you've heard from Andy Fancher. I just want you to know your subscriptions are what let us, all of us, do the work that you've just seen. And if you go to FITSNews.com, if you read our articles and follow our stories there, again, those subscriptions empower everything that we do. They are our lifeblood. So if you haven't already, if you believe in local news, if you believe in independent media, if you believe in outlets that are genuinely searching for the truth and seeking to tell it to their best conception, please, it's only $8 a month. Go to FITSNews.com and subscribe today. Again, Jen, Dylan, Andy, and I all dependent on your help to drive what we do here. Thanks for joining us. We'll catch you next week on The Week in Review.